troublemaker in our society. He persists in sharpening his words until they have a pointed consistency that sometimes hurts. He piles them up until they form ideas. Some of these ideas have a bludgeon-like effect, and it's unpleasant at times. He troubles us because we never quite know what the writer, what the artist is going to say or do next. So when his persistence makes him impossible to ignore, and he unreasonably refuses to change either the sharpness of his words or the impact of his ideas, we try to censor or stop his artistic expression. His reaction is often positive, and the literature of court adjudications is both extensive and growing. Tonight's speaker, however, travels another road. Dr. Jascha Kessler will discuss some implications of the artist himself as censor and art itself as the hand and tool of censorship. Dr. Kessler is a poet and playwright as well as associate professor of English at UCLA. He's the author of American Poems, a contemporary collection, an anthology of new poetry by 15 young poets. He has written 2 experimental plays, Perfect Days and The Dummy, which were produced professionally on the LA campus in 1965. He was a fellow of the university's Institute of Creative Arts, a Fulbright research professor in Italy, guest lecturer in poetry to President Shazar of Israel, D.H. Lawrence Fellow in Writing, and a Danforth Fellow in Writing. And through a great deal of searching, I found out that Dr. Kessler is also a member of that organization called ASCAP. Now, he shares this membership with such people as Richard Rogers and Irving Berlin. I think that the composer of The End of a Perfect Day, Carrie Jacobs Bond, however, was not a member of ASCAP. But Dr. Kessler has this distinction because of a libretto for an opera, which he has written. Tonight he will speak on the censorship of art and the art of censorship. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jascha Kessler.
Thank you very much, Professor Cushman. The phrase that Professor Cushman used of the artist, pointed consistency, strikes terror to my heart because I'm not sure how pointed or how consistent some of the remarks I'll have to make tonight are, or how censorable. The censorship of art and the art of censorship. Am I coming through to you? Can you hear me? Pessimism is the approved mood of modern critics of culture, especially humanistic critics. Since our problems have devolved into insolubility over the last half-century, they may be excused their pessimism concerning not merely matters of culture, but the whole of human existence. A pessimism so deep and vast that it appears inevitable. Yet a writer like Albert Camus, not endowed with a cheery nature, was able to say in 1957, the year before his accidental death, that since atomic war would divest any future of its meaning, it gives us complete freedom of action. We have nothing to lose except everything. So let's go ahead. Well, there's a kind of exhilaration at this nadir of pessimism. Such strange emotion may be a natural psychological response. I think it has been attested to by the phenomenon of conversion, salvation, and rebirth, the resurrection of the spirit. It is the climax of heroic myths whose patterns lie at a deeper level than those of tragic actions. Nevertheless, though we may find ourselves, or think we find ourselves, individually reborn, or allow ourselves to rely on that resilience and adaptability of the human spirit with its constant novelty, it would be unwise to do so blinded by animal faith. Unwise because it is merely shunting off on our children the task of survival in a world we think unfit for survival. As if we'd been marched into the wilderness and knowing that we'd never leave it alive, refused to tell them where they were and whatever else we thought we knew about the few techniques for survival we had learned. I'm explicitly not saying we should be imparting to them a few legends about where we'd come from, or how or why we'd arrived at this desperate condition, this exorbitant settlement, this camp on quicksands. Those they will invent for themselves, with a few deductions and hypotheses about the worn-out tools, the shattered syntax, dishonest customs, and incoherent explanations that may remain to them, just as generations past have done with theirs. No, I'm thinking specifically tonight about our need to understand for our own small self-respect, if not for the sake of that understanding itself. Now, Camus's was a model spirit, I think we all agree, and one must approve his fortitude. Now, to illustrate my apprehension of our situation, here's a fresh anecdote. Recently, a scientist I know was telephoned by another from a laboratory in the East, actually a great research installation of the Army. My friend has reached a fascinating stage in his investigation of the metabolism, say, of lung cells. Well, the Army scientist asked if he could fly out to talk with him about the stuff he's discovered, and on arrival turned out to be in his 20s, and very well informed. My friend somehow couldn't get the drift of their conversation. There was a question there beyond his interested curiosity. Irritated, he finally asked him what he was after, and he was frankly told that the Army was looking at the thing because if, you see, a substance could be concocted that controlled the metabolic absorption of these certain acids, which my friend had just determined essential for the work of lung cells, then by applying it to food or water or spraying it in the air, one could constrict an entire population, say a prisoner's camp, or a factory city, a countryside, a province, even a nation, in order to render it docile before attack or obedient after occupation. If people so dosed exerted themselves too much, as they would if they were fighting, subverting, or escaping, they'd automatically drop dead, because the substance in their blood would have limited in advance the amount of these certain acids essential to lung cell metabolism. Although scientists have gotten over the qualms they sometimes suffered 20 years ago, still my friend was a trifle surprised. "I thought you were interested in metabolism, not applications," he said. "Oh, of course, that too," responded this new-style double-thinker. "It's just that the Army's intrigued by the idea of such a life-saving control. And we wondered if you, that is, thought you might, well, long ago, military delegations sought out Daedalus, and even before that, certain gods went down from Olympus to consult Hephaestus the smith for weapons." Now, this story suggests to me that whereas wars have developed from field combat to engage whole populations, as in Russia and Germany 25 years ago, and that whereas the stalemate of powers now persists because of the potentiality of instant annihilation, thus putting the game back on the chessboard, we have reached no conclusion whatever, but are hunting out new weapons. It may be better from now on not to think along the lines of mere destruction, but to seek a sort of spiritual domination, which is, after all, what human warfare is really about, and not the pacific domination as through the dissemination of languages or religions or techniques, but conquest in the old barbaric mode of bodily possession, and yet still not brutally with nerve gas or with death ray or with plague, which leave us the bother of all those poisoned cadavers, but the benevolent possession of a whole society, a society intact. Revolt being impossible because a surge of activity would render death immediate. Yet, on reflection, this sort of weapon would be no more terrible a weapon than war itself, which is spiritual aggression, whether it is the witch doctor's curse or an orbiting neutron bomb. Such a weapon would constitute a physical censorship, an elegant weapon for an army. It's cheap, beautifully efficient, and specific, and it has the rudimentary power of a mental censorship thrown in for good measure. Nevertheless, such a censor is fundamentally mechanical, and a better way to wage war is through the spirit. Tsarist Russia offers us modern censorship in what I call its classical form. Since the censor is always silent, the The following definition comes from a writer and covers the artist's problem thoroughly. So far as I know, it hasn't appeared in English as yet, so I hope you'll excuse my quoting it at length. It describes all possible cases, for my purposes at least, of any sort of censorship in any country today. I talked about censorship, about its excessive strictness in our time, and I complained about it, for I felt that a certain misunderstanding had arisen which was the cause of the tense situation weighing upon literature. I was distressed that the profession of a writer was debased in our time, thanks to some dark suspicion, and that censorship sees in the writer, even before he has written anything, a natural enemy of the government, and undertakes to examine the manuscript with prejudice already manifest. I'm distressed to hear that a certain work is being prohibited, not because some liberal, free-thinking, immoral elements were found in it, but because, for example, the story or the novel has an excessively sad ending, because it presents an excessively dark picture, even though this picture does not denounce or cast suspicion upon anyone in society, and even though the tragedy itself occurs in a perfectly accidental, non-connected manner. Let them examine all that I have written, whether it has been published or not. Let them check the manuscripts of my published works, so that they might see what they looked like before they reached the censor. And let them find in them a single word contrary to morality and to the established status quo. And yet I have been subjected to this kind of prohibition precisely because the picture was painted with excessively dark colors. Oh, if they only knew into what a depressed state the author of the prohibited work is driven. He's faced with the prospect of being deprived for 3 months of his daily bread, and worse, for the work provided me with the means of subsistence, and into the bargain, in the midst of privations, of depression, almost of despair, for apart from the question of money, one is depressed to the point of despair, seeing one's work, which one loved, into which one invested labor, health, the best of one's spiritual energies, prohibited because of a misunderstanding, because of a suspicion. I say, in the midst of privation, of despair, one has to find, nevertheless, enough light and gay hours in order to write, at the same time, a new work of literature in bright, rosy, pleasing colors. And write it one must, for one must live. If I talked, if I complained a little, and I complained so little, does it mean that I was a free thinker? And then what did I complain about? About the misunderstanding. More precisely, I was endeavoring with all my forces to prove that every writer is a priori suspicious, that he's looked upon with perplexity, with mistrust, and I accuse the writers themselves for not searching for the means of dispelling the pernicious misunderstanding. Pernicious because literature can hardly exist in such a tense situation. Entire genres of literature are doomed to disappear. Already satire, tragedy cannot exist. Nor could writers like Griboyev, Fonevitsyn, and even Pushkin exist in the face of the strictness of the present-day censorship. Now, satire derides vice, and in most cases vice under the guise of virtue. How can there be any derision at the present time? The censor sees an illusion in everything, suspects that a certain personality is meant, suspects malice, and wonders whether the author alludes to some person and to a certain state of affairs. I myself have often had the occasion, forgetting my sadness, to burst out laughing at what the censor had found harmful for society and too awkward to be published in my or other people's manuscripts. I laughed because nowadays no one else but the censor would ever conceive similar suspicions. In the most innocent, the most pure phrase, the most criminal thought is suspected, which the censor obviously pursues with all his intellectual powers as an eternal fixed idea which he cannot get out of his head, which he himself created, shaken by fear and suspicion, which he himself made real in his imagination and painted with terrible, unheard-of colors. And at last he destroyed his phantom, together with the innocent cause of his fear, the innocent original phrase of the author. As if, by concealing vice and the dark side of life, one could conceal from the reader the fact that there is the dark side of life in this world. No, the writer will not conceal this dark side by leaving it out. He will only cause the reader to suspect him of insincerity, of untruthfulness. And then, is it even possible to paint with nothing but bright colors? How can the bright side of the picture become evident without the dark one? Can there be a picture without both light and shadow? We have a notion of light only because there is shadow. They tell us, describe nothing but excellence and virtue. But we do not get to know virtue without vice. The very concepts of good and evil have come from the fact that good and evil have always existed together, hand in hand. Yet I need only think of presenting ignorance, vice, abuse, haughtiness, violence. The censor will immediately become suspicious of me and will think that I speak of everything in general, without exception. I'm not in favor of representing vice and the dark side of life. I'm not fond of either. I only speak in the interest of art. Well, as you may have guessed, that statement is Dostoevsky's. It was not an argument composed at leisure for a journal, but was addressed to the authority that stands behind the censor's ambiguous office. It was Dostoevsky's final deposition to the court, written in the prison of St. Peter and St. Paul, the night before he was taken out to be shot with some others for having read a piece, Belinsky's letter to Gogol, at what we would call today a literary soiree. And despite his further protest, that he'd not even expressed bias in his tone of voice, that he was utterly innocent, that he'd even been framed, perhaps he would have been executed anyway, had not commutation arrived at the last possible moment, and he was sentenced instead to Siberia, whence he returned years later, though the others with him did not survive. Now, such an appalling episode may define for us classic censorship, which was an autocratic means of restricting journalism and literature from reaching the people, as Dostoevsky notes later in this plea when he remarks that civilization must be imposed from above. Now, this censorship is located in the self-aggrandizing bureaucratic core, empowered to suppress what is morally or politically objectionable, and is what most of us today would call the enemy. One can point at it. Right now, for instance, the Tertz affair has just been concluded. Abram Tertz is the pseudonym of a writer who has the satiric power of Jonathan Swift, and his works have appeared only in the West, smuggled out of the USSR. Now, with a few others, Andrei Sinyavsky, who seems to be a very important critic and is the editor of the newly published collection of Pasternak's poetry, has been arrested, accused of being Tertz, and of insulting Russia by publishing works of pornography and moral squalor abroad. What's interesting to me is that a paper like the New York Times, several times, earlier chose to publish small extracts from Tertz which seemed to be wholly political satire, whereas this writer's work, taken in its entirety, shows his thought to be of another order altogether. The object of his ferocity is not totalitarian tyranny merely, just as Orwell was not merely concerned with political terror in 1984. Tertz's profound loathing blankets all of contemporary society. For example, there is a very revealing moment in The Trial Begins when the defense counsel, a cynical intellectual, says to a nascent girl rebel, let's call her a neo-Trotskyist, though she's as ignorant of Trotsky as our collegiate left is ignorant of history, who has come to him for advice because the group of children she leads has suddenly discovered that Russia lives under bureaucratic dictatorship. That if they ever succeeded in establishing the society they dream of, that is, a democratic socialist state, they'd only be exchanging despotism for a free form of slavery. Well, naturally, the girl flees his office, terrified by that bombshell of a thought. No. Tertz's ideas, recently published as notes in Thought Unaware, reveal a mind that has not cropped up in Russia for many years, perhaps centuries. No matter who Tertz may be, a political trial was an irrelevancy. Meanwhile, we did our part to see that Sinyavsky was punished with 7 years of hard labor by praising blindly what some of us happen to think mere anti-Soviet satire, though Thought Aware had been sent out to us to clarify our understanding. In The Trial Begins, incidentally, the characters in the book end up in Kolyma, the camp which has always been at the end of the line, as General Gorbatov the other year in his published memoirs showed us. Now, were the young Dostoevsky here today, his deposition would have helped us to help them to see to it that he did not live to write his masterpieces. Proof? Consider the statement by the young Yugoslav critic Mihailov, who, after being let off a jail term for slandering Russia with his articles called Moscow, Summer 1964, in Borba, a Yugoslav paper, wrote yet another piece to say that communists never protested because the Western press ballyhoos their criticism, and so turns the lights on in the interrogation cells. And besides, communist intellectuals are patriotic anti-capitalists. In short, the Western press thereby, and also, helps to censor communists behind the Iron Curtain, and helps to stifle any criticism they might wish to make. And as far as I'm concerned, at this point, the suggestion of such an affair in the last year, to me, is that censorship is apolitical and universal in a deeper sense than that merely of bureaucratic mugging. We move thus into the realm of paranoia. Now, such a world is, like the paranoiac himself, unaware of its sickness. In fact, it no longer seems a disease. That is the structure of paranoia. Dostoevsky's letter to the judge not only describes a state of paranoia well, but ironically shows us how it was possible for him to deal with such a society later on, while at the same time leaving it to posterity to believe that he was himself an arch reactionary. He goes on to state, incidentally, that censorship prevents writers from clearing the German words out of the language, and thereby from clearing German ideas out of the language, because the censorship restricts their Russian books. Sure, never was great wit so near to madness allied. Easy for paranoia. Why should we think, however, that it is endemic only in totalitarian establishments? To illustrate, in a minor key, let's look at a current children's fad today. I mean the spy craze. Our infatuation with the agents may have literary antecedents in the detective novel, the murder mystery, the gothic romance, and ghost tales, but its lineaments are pure contemporary. Our agents are remorseless, amoral, lethal characters, bestially egotistic and attractively bestial in a way that will draw attention to them even in a crowd of sophisticates around the baccarat table. And our absorption in their doings may represent our fantasy interest in what we have not, their discipline over the body, their minds super trained to react to invisible clues, their ability to go anywhere, even to penetrate places forbidden to high officials, their physical and mental armament, extra legally furnished by the power of all of us combined, that is, our governments, and their mere instrumentality on behalf of our security. They not only deceive the enemy, but usually absorb punishments to an inhuman degree, punishments the resourceful enemy meant for us. And paradoxically, or childishly, their operations are disclosed in such a way that a real spy's usefulness, so shown, would be nil. Surely this is paranoiac. Yet, since the paranoiac is sensitive to real, if unconscious, hostility, and accurately identifies its source, we can say that the pattern is completed by observing that there are many real agents, real plans, and real plots in our midst. If in those other countries the theory of government regards everyone as a present or potential subversive, as in Terz's the trial begins, then it's possible to add that in the consciousness of each of ourselves, we regard ourselves as traitors. This is certainly the theory of the John Birch Society, and others like it, as certain radio broadcasts in California will show you. On the other hand, we also label as psychopaths those who have no feelings of guilt at all. That is, we say that those who cannot judge themselves are sick. It may be a matter of degree, but do I go too far in associating the normal with the abnormal when I assume that a certain number of dissidents have, since the Enlightenment, been both admired and certified as sick, although in our contemporary fantasies we employ some of those very same types as our heroes in the unremitting struggle not against an anachronistic Satan, but against the enemies of our status, who are legion. Such, in any case, is the political theory of 1984, and such is the reality adumbrated by Terz, by Valery Tarsus in Ward 7, by Chekhov in Ward 6, by Yuli Daniel, arrested with Sinyavsky, accused of being Nikolai Arshak, the author of Moscow Calling, by General Gorbutov in his Memoirs of the Purge, by Solzhenitsyn, and so forth. Incidentally, Camus's narrator in The Fall, his last novel, is an ex-lawyer, and his monologued, self-examining, self-lacerating, self-condemning confession leads inexorably towards accusation of the reader and towards the claim that he has earned the right to judge the guilty of the world, especially all of those who, like the reader, believe themselves to be innocent. No one is innocent. And it might also be recalled that Dr. Zhivago, who refused to judge anyone, was suffocated in a crowded trolley car, the image of modern mass society, though they wrote heart attack on his death certificate. Now, as if in answer to the modern proclivity to term paranoid suspicion a disease, many ultra-conservatives, incidentally, especially in California, call the mental health programs communist plots. So much for the picture of the world implied by what I've called classic censorship. I want to return to the theme of paranoia again a little later. Moving now to consider the conditions of our life in a general way, I would like to suggest that the theme of these lectures, man's right to know, might someday have to come to include his right not to know. In order to develop this suggestion, I shall talk over a number of topics connected in my mind with the idea of order. When I was in my teens, I read a science fiction novella, probably a spy story, that included the account of a remarkable device. It was so interesting, in fact, that it's the only special gimmick I can evoke in my memory from a vast heap of material I consumed at that time. And possibly I recall it merely because it's associated with my wrestlings with the cigarette in those days. You'll see how it links up, however, in a moment. I think I remember that the hero, who was a Bond prototype, was trying to get at an alien criminal syndicate operating over a planetary scale. He had been forewarned, and indeed he'd been forearmed, by hypnotic screens against their principal weapon, which attacked the mind. It worked on the principle, by analogy, of the fingerprint, or the Australian chirunga. Each person's having a specific brainwave pattern, the criminals got hold of you by locking onto yours, apparently by having you contemplate visually the pattern that synchronized with your own. Now, I've forgotten what the trade name in the thriller was, so I call it here the mind gripper. At some point, the hero went into a crummy dive to reconnoiter or to make a contact, and happening to be out of cigarettes, put a coin in the machine. Out it came, and lo, while stripping the cellophane from the pack, he noticed something odd about the familiar design. Too late. Losing consciousness under the blinding light in his forebrain, he knew only that the mind gripper had trapped him. Well, as Hamlet remarked to Horatio, death can lie in wait, even in an auger hole. For me, it was also a shocking moment, associated as it was with cigarettes. But why has this little episode stayed with me so long? In this context, the mind gripper offers at least two clues, one ancient, the other modern. Both useful notions for discussing the aesthetic intelligence, if it is an intelligence. One may term the ancient idea mnemonic, the charm, the riddle, the rhyme, the conjurer's emblem, formula rather, or the Vatic emblem of the conjurer. Its modern transmogrification could be the jingle, the slogan, the trademark, either commercial or political, such as the swastika that the wild ones wear in California, again, to badger those who wear the badge of the official order. Now, all forms of the mind gripper are meant to resonate, to cause the mind to respond urgently as to a post-hypnotic suggestion. Now, ancient or modern, the mind gripper is essentially a poetic device. One makes and wishes to use a machine to control the mind. Of course, such a machine is also reductive and is intended either to bring us to its level or to make us dependent upon it in some way. We hope it will give us some sort of power, but in itself it is equivocal and so often enslaves us. The best that can be said is that we willingly enslave ourselves. Why should we blame the machine itself in another little paranoid tantrum? After all, the Lama has his prayer wheel and his formula to connect him with infinite nothingness. The rabbi of Lvov had some words on paper that once inserted into the mouth of his golem animated the monster, and we have taped programs we feed into our mathematical machines. Possibly all mnemonics are versions of the word that was breathed into the mouth of Adam to make him live. In any case, since all our creations are simpler than our own minds, I think of them as peculiarly apt synonyms for censorship, which is another arrangement for control of the intelligence. In 1932, Paul Valéry said, "If we tried to apply in the realm of politics the ideas about man which we find in the current doctrines of science, life would probably become unbearable for most of us. There would be a general revolt of feeling in the face of such strict application of perfectly rational data. For it would end, in fact, by classifying each individual, invading his personal life, sometimes killing or mutilating certain degenerate or inferior types." Well, within a few years, the Nazis were not only practicing an arbitrary program of state eugenics, but tattooing numbers on millions they had selected for extermination. And even the prisoners knew each other only whence and when they had come by the category of the number alone. Now, I'm not making a facetious reference in order to allude to the universal processing of people as census and revenue data, or to the management of telephones, or to student protests against IBM tags, but reminding you only of the reductive magic of certain tools. What concerns me is the notion I am entertaining, that monstrous evil of the Nazis, or these conveniences of ours, look like limited instances of a general condition. That is, the natural human need to render the world's disorder into a natural human order. It may be inescapable. It may be what makes us human. Whether the device be the aboriginal poetic epic of a tribe's origin handed down by immemorial recitation, or an automatic computation of galactic distributions, it may well be the necessary activity of the mind. Consequently, I ask myself if we really know what we mean when we speak of freedom, the freedom of the artist, and if we really mean to go far enough in our thinking about the source of censorship, and what it is that the artist may be doing or intending, whether he knows himself or not. It may simply be the case that the artist whose work once affected and perhaps effected his entire community can no longer reach far or wide enough, and that others have taken over his role using the very same means and in more or less the same ways on a scale that will alter humanity itself. If this is so, the artist as we think of him will have vanished. Why so? Again, Valéry, in every way we are circumscribed, dominated by a hidden or obvious regimentation extending to everything, and we are so bewildered by the chaos of stimuli obsessing us that we end by needing it. Now, we have already accepted much more of the simply technologized than Valéry might have supposed possible in 1932, although he asked us to be ready for anything or almost anything. And he went on to say, "Are these not detestable conditions for the future productions of works of art comparable to those which humanity has created in preceding centuries? We have lost the leisure to ripen, and if we look into ourselves as artists, we no longer find that other virtue of our predecessors in the creation of beauty, the aim to endure. Of the many beliefs I have said were dying, one is already gone. That is the belief in posterity and its judgment." Now, 34 years have gone by, and by American reckoning, that is an eon. For Americans, even the idea of posterity may not exist. Our various time capsules are prepared and buried not for posterity, but for aliens. Today, we seem to be groping at a barrier that has no specific density or location. For convenience, I call it the censor. What or who is it? It may help at this point to say that there is a slight etymological confusion in our use of the word, stemming from a mistranslation of Freud's psychoanalytical term, Zensur, which means not censor, but censorship, a dynamic aggregate of selective agencies that suppress memories and thought and inhibit impulses and behavior. That's the dictionary. We use censor, a person, group, or anonymous bureau of such persons, interchangeably with censorship, which is their activity. But there is no discriminating the two in a paranoid society or in the paranoid character of ourselves. If there were, presidents might not be assassinated, nor their putative assassins, for that matter. But it is clear that this confusion of persons and forces helps us recognize that I'm talking about two different aspects of one matter. That is, a self-censorship, which is also a universal and impersonal censorship. Both causes and effects of each other. If it's not a very clear notion, one of the elements of its imprecision is an attitude that is set against understanding, yet pretends to be scientifically rational. Now, Valéry was precisely to the point, again, in 1932. The growth of the positivist mentality, a growth resulting from the ever tighter organization of the world, where measurable things more and more dominate the scene, where the vagueness of vague things is more and more obvious, is undermining the ancient foundations of society. The vagueness of vague things. Now, the positivist mentality will either discount the importance of vague things or learn to manipulate them for simple purposes, generally reductive and oppressive purposes, exactly because they are seen to be relatively unimportant. History, art, law, language, for examples. Now, as an amusing example of the positivist censorship in action, a very small example, I recall a psychologist's demonstration to me of the working of a year-long statistical experiment in behavior. He was studying the rate at which rats learn. By means of the usual sealed boxes equipped with food, water, each dispensed by the activation of a trip lever and guarded by a shock grid which ensured that any rat that tried obtaining nourishment without performing his bit of biblically enjoined work, lever pressing, was jolted. My friend was musing about a consistent statistical skewing in his electronic counter-upper of learning rates when he discovered that the cause was one large rat who somehow took food without ever pressing the lever or getting shocked. Naturally, rat wasn't telling him how it was done. So Dr. Scientist put him in various boxes, no doubt about it. Mr. Rat had taught himself a novel technique for getting something for nothing. Well, I asked if he thought the rat a genius, if he had devised new tests for him, if he had bred him, if he had, well, looking at me with contempt, he said merely, "I destroyed him, of course." Now, scientific, or if you will, scientistic positivism is the only thing that has emerged from the cultural crisis and the loss of faith in all values that Valéry was describing in 1932. Scientific, or if you will, scientistic positivism, has also filled that vacuum, and in the process it has often grotesquely changed. Its fundamental set, that all things are intrinsically measurable and ascertainable, even vague things, has accompanied and shared in the events of our times in ways that most positivists, especially in the universities, let's say, would denounce or would deny that it helped to bring about. Nevertheless, we must admit that we have abandoned humanity as it was known until, say, 1932. I think it's relatively easy to see this now, almost a quarter of a century after the convulsion of the Second World War, and to say that we are far beyond that crisis, having left behind even its last stages, nihilism, post-Western man, post-existential man, even ideological man. The term under which we are surveying the present seems to be mass man. Of course, the first to have seen where we were and where we were going were the artists. And among them, a special group must be singled out as having been the first to respond. I mean, the Surrealists. If I may briefly recount the episode, oversimplifying as I go along, I hope to make the point excruciatingly clear. The invention of Dada, around 1918, by the genius Tristan Tzara, was an answer to the implicit utter nihilism of the First World War. For the survivors, Dada said that if art was something that corresponds to the arrangements of its world, then no art but Dada was possible. And Tzara demonstrated that vividly by various small acts of chaos that commented on the chaos of reality. The point was easily made for those who could understand. Surrealism was the immediate artistic child of Dada, but showed itself essentially different. Beginning with the premise that art was no more, Surrealism set out on its revolutionary way to transform life itself. For life is all you have left once the order, that is art, is removed, especially the false order of an art that is unrelated to the present reality. Now, the handiest organized means for doing life, as one does philosophy, was the scientific method. The Surrealist hypothesis was simply that since life itself is an incomprehensible collection of events, as contrasted with the arbitrary sequences that bourgeois society had composed its now shattered order with, using all the means that art and mechanistic science, etc., give it, the best way to begin investigation was to collect the overlooked clues, especially, for convenience's sake, the events of the mind, and to examine them, after which, once identified and verified, they could be used to effect a new lifestyle. For the mind was now, for the first time, seen to have most of its processes below the level of consciousness, like an iceberg. In fact, speaking loosely, consciousness itself was recognized explicitly as the censorship, working in the service of the autocratic reason, which subjugated the vast living mass of the populace of the spirit, the elementals of desire, or the drives of the libido, and permitted only certain social and artistic channels to be expressed. Reason, which the French too easily equate with society, was at fault. The French too easily equate it with civilization. And the censor, by the Surrealists, was to be destroyed as the tool of tyranny. Now, they formed the Bureau of Surrealist Research, and there they experimented in the attempt to find the language of the whole mind, beginning, as it were, empirically from zero. Automatic writings, dreams, trances, hypnotic speech, and drawing, and all the rest of the so-called automatisms that seem to speak prophetically when called upon from below. Of course, it is significant that they excluded the interpretation of mediumship, the occult, angels, demons, the lost worlds of the religious and pre-scientific mentality, the Kabbalah, which was a very popular form of experimentation at that time, the superstitions that religion and rational theology, for that matter, also exclude. Now, like Dada, Surrealism, being up to date, even avant-garde, was an international movement, just as science and technology were international. And one may see that Surrealism was the last revolutionary art movement, and it came quite naturally at the time when true revolution was still possible in the world. Tzara, of course, when invited, refused to join the Surrealist Bureau, correctly foreseeing what ultimately did come to pass: the world's acceptance of the products of Surrealist research as art objects in their own right, the result being merely a new collection of things that implied a concept of order only that much larger than the now defunct bourgeois order. Furthermore, although the outraged custodians of the past couldn't see it, Tristan Tzara also foresaw that since the Surrealists were programmatically seeking to transform life by liberating desire and discovering reality and the marvelous by positivistic experiments, they would soon have to compete or to comply with other forces aiming at the establishment of a new order. We know what happened. Communism identified itself with revolution, and the Surrealists became communists. Or, as in Dali's case, they espoused Franco's Phalange and the Catholic Church. Although they insisted on the right, even when they became communists, to retain psychical freedom because they were avant-garde artists, they were, of course, immediately denied it, and eventually they were cut loose from the party, or they were forced to renounce Surrealism, as did the two prime spirits, Aragon and Éluard. It was logical. Communism or fascism, no different in this respect from the bourgeoisie, will have its own vision of social order and impose its own censorship on desire, while Surrealism insisted on the untrammeled order that arises spontaneously from the structure of the psyche itself. It was a battle of positivisms. Now, when I used the word subconsciousness once to a positivist, a professor of behaviorist psychology, he shouted back at me, "Spooks!" Significantly, the Surrealists assumed that the order arising from the whole of our psyche is itself autonomous and logically implies the still-to-be-developed system of a possible human life. Such a life was perhaps a little too free for the old gangs, bourgeois or communist. Nevertheless, essentially speaking, the Surrealists would have soon come up against the barrier I have been implying, that of the mind itself. The mind itself, by its nature, is the ultimate censor, and varies its prohibitions merely as the times vary. Now, this sounds circular or self-defeating in the extreme. I would point out that a few of the principal Surrealist experimenters saw from the very outset that incoherent insanity or suicide were the major alternatives that lay ahead of the breakthrough they were seeking. Eventually, they found them. René Crevel committed suicide. Antonin Artaud died insane. They were pure revolutionaries indeed. As for Dali, like many of the young Surrealists, he had an artistic career ahead of him. Others abandoned Surrealism, which called not for art, but life. While Dali, whom Breton dubbed Avida Dollars, exploited Surrealism, he's still producing fake objects a la mode and calls himself the master. I think he's having a big happening in New York about now, and a big show of Surrealist artifacts. In short, Surrealism, for Dali, has kept him afloat in a society that has by now caught up with his advanced practice of 40 years ago. And if there's any fault in Dali, it is not reaction, but the failure to maintain his lead. It was no accident, incidentally, that Dali, who was a second-wave Surrealist, introduced paranoia criticism to the movement. For paranoia is a highly structured psychosis, and it displays an extraordinary attachment to the world, in contradistinction to, say, schizophrenia, or the depressions, or to the compromises of neurosis. When Dali invented the term paranoia criticism, Nazism and Stalinism were just crystallizing out of the revolutionary world ferment. How well Dali knew in 1930 that you have to get to the paranoiac before he systematically gets to you. Now, it is clear that Surrealism, the revolt of artistic spirits, came when genuine revolution was still possible. Being revolutionary, it had a rational spirit and method, and it was congenitally devoted to psychoanalysis, upon which it depended intellectually for support. Today, revolutions in art and in politics are manufactured and commercialized in the advanced countries for export, where life itself has so imitated Surrealism as to vitiate it or destroy it, or has transformed it instead of being transformed by it. Now, in the totalitarian countries, revolution is being built systematically into the propagandized structure of society in a way quite analogous to the methods utilized to generate change in commercial, that is to say, capitalist countries. Now, Surrealism obviously lost its revolution and failed to transform life, although it was romantic to have discovered desire and to have reinvented sexuality, both of which are fundamental to the technology of advertising communications today. As artists, the Surrealists were the last to maintain the illusion of freedom. And in honor of their heroism, it must be admitted that theirs was a noble illusion, maintained to the point where they discovered the truth that we are repressed from within as well as from without, and that the censorship of society is projected from the censor within each of us and all of us. Squeezed between those walls, the bravest committed suicide or went mad, as I have said, leaving behind for 40 years a silent Marcel Duchamp, a silent Tristan Tzara, an endlessly garrulous, wealthy Dali, a few Tanguys, a few Max Ernst, a few René Magrittes for the museums, even some Giacometti, early Giacometti, and Breton himself in America, silent. The lesson of Surrealism is there for our instruction. And the question it leads to, the relation of the artist to mass society, is now very much to the point. Before the Holocaust of the last war, Valéry bravely said in 1939, "No one has ever been kept from thinking as he wishes. But if anything characterizes the nature of the mass man now emerging, it is that he will be thinking as he wishes, but what he wishes is what is wished for him to think." About 1946, Orwell defined doublethink, which put succinctly says that for those who think that 2 + 2 are 4, they must also think that 2 + 2 are 5. The methods in that book used to force this thought upon those who take it upon themselves to think at all will come to seem medievally crude by the time we have reached 1984. One can imagine a situation in which broadcasters and filmmakers could be allowed to extend their programs to the other wavelengths, as it were, so as to saturate human receivers by transmissions simultaneously of all sorts of sub- and superliminal materials. This would be a challenge, of course, to enemy propaganda. Of course, this is a paranoid fantasy of mine. One can turn the thing off, though apparently many do so infrequently. As it is today, the mass man in the urban world is flooded, fragmented, and pulverized by increasing quantities and levels of stimuli that are highly organized to achieve control over him. And the quantity of artificial stimuli broadcast and received in the most primitive parts of the world is constantly increasing. Now, all such transmissions, structured communications, are propaganda, and are not only artistic in nature, but act at the same time to exclude art itself by a training of the sensibility in their terms. Art is generally more complex than such mass communications, and therefore unavailable, unless it has been designed in advance to offer the same but even more intense sensation. No one has to censor art today and tomorrow, because the conditions of our life have already done so. The introspective person knows that protection from such stimuli is impossible, for the portable receiver is already inside ourselves, which have been smashed to pieces from the very beginning and re-prefabricated so that the loud-speaking voice, the image, and the rhythm predominates over our own thoughts. In terms of non-ideas and unthoughts, one can hear almost any person today from the age of 2 repeating and reproducing the forms and content of his present social experience, which is largely conducted by such media. Now, this form of censorship is indirect, supersaturating, and universally applicable to the individual in the mass, and renders him identical with the mass. Politically speaking, Goebbels was the first to theorize about its potentialities. And both Lenin and Stalin and their heirs began to develop its methods as fast as they could. Mao, starting later but with an even more innocent batch of people, has apparently gone far beyond the rest, although when you consider what is involved in voluntarily bringing Americans up to behave as they do in our technologized society, compared with which China seems as yet lost in antiquity, you can appreciate how much further along we are in the manipulation of the mind. So far as our inborn capacities are concerned, the world is becoming asphalted off from us. And the tool that is so handy in this evolution is the mind gripper, literacy, whether it be the letter, the image, the loud-speaking voice, or all in combination. It is possible that neither the block warden, nor the secret police, nor even the lung cell metabolic governor will be needed. For the mind being both the target and the weapon, the aesthetic sensibility will be the means of control. And the arts must form the basis for the techniques of control. This has been shown very clearly by the steadily more rapid assimilation of so many artistic inventions by the designers of advertising and the purveyors of information, all of which is propaganda during the last 50 years. Already the media have begun leaving the artist behind, the self-directing, self-employing, and self-amusing artist, leaving him even vocationless. I have said that generally speaking, most of the art produced from Paleolithic times was meant to be either a control of society or of the self, which is perhaps one of the purposes of self-expression, unless we compare art to spontaneous animal cries or bird song. But the self-directed artist of recent history may already be becoming superfluous so far as society is concerned, as Dada and Surrealism assumed in 1920. The artist who develops himself in the old-fashioned way may be doing something else from what the world demands of him. He is obsolete. One might say, for instance, that abstract art, as an example, is, as the Soviet censors know in their hearts, a most unpopular and uncontemporary thing. Practiced by a Russian, abstract art is rightly considered an individualist subversion, except as wallpaper or textile design. And who would wear a genuine Pollock? Although you see, we wear Mondrian. In the West, it is merely irrelevant so far as our culture is concerned. I mean that this sort of art is a luxury that is permitted only because our society still permits luxuries. I once heard from an artist that one of the Rockefellers had said in his presence to de Kooning, "We buy your work to keep you quiet. You're dangerous people." This was uncommonly frank. It must be recalled, as de Kooning pointed out, that during the Depression and during the war, de Kooning painted ships at Todd's shipyards, while the social realists were doing the post office murals for society. Yet, can the artist afford to consider himself a luxury? Must he not believe himself and in his work, in some sense, that it is somehow fundamentally necessary? But the art that is necessary to a society is thereby subject to the editing of the censor, because censorship is, in the most freely conceivable of free worlds, the means of delimiting the utility of mental controls. And utility need not exclude beauty, as primitive art shows us. And of course, the modern discovery of the primitive arts exposes our own deep need for the anonymous artist of propaganda. It was an old-fashioned Thorsten Veblen who said that a spoon was a spoon, whether it was Tiffany or tin. The modern world will invent schools of design. At the present stage, totalitarian force is still used to achieve in the artist a sense of necessity, so that the censor is still felt to be external to the artist. That is why Dostoevsky pleaded for understanding from the censor, so that he might be allowed to contribute towards Russification. And that is why, now that the censor is in Russia, for instance, or in Nazi Germany, avant-garde, Terz had to smuggle his reactionary writings abroad to the decadent West. That is why sophisticates in the West are camping with Batman and with television reruns of old movies and serials, because of the excruciating pleasures to be found in what are called popular folk mass cult anonymous productions, C movies made by unknowns. Yet, if there are to be no artists, but official propaganda artists in the future, is the coming choice for self-directed artists that of opting out, of going underground, for instance, as is the case in the communist countries of Europe? And is that a choice worth dignifying by the word? When we say underground, incidentally, I think we tend to be thinking of the catacombs, so that we ought to be looking forward to the day when we emerge from the catacombs to do what? To take over the bureaucratic state, as happened once before? Christian art, I would remind you, once it became official, certainly seemed indifferent to what had vanished from the aesthetic sensibility forever. Now, it's a set of dilemmas we may not have to face. And in any case, in the world of mass-produced, mass man, the artist, being human, art will offer what is asked for. Why should it be otherwise? Still, it is a pity that we have begun, not merely by extinguishing the past and substituting false forms, but also with the intention of creating these forms merely as ephemeral forms. I'm no prophet, but I recall with dread Camus's Swedish speech, Create Dangerously, in which he said that art in the future will be walking a thin and high ridge between the abyss of frivolity on the one hand and the abyss of propaganda on the other. In the free world, our only remaining slack is solitude and wealth. And as for wealth, Willem de Kooning, drunk once, at a Museum of Modern Art opening, threw his arms around the bediamonded dowager, and said to her, "You look like $1,000,000. Thank you.
Dr. Kessler will be happy to entertain some questions if some of you have some. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sparing me, too.